my browser asked me to switch to a different profile, and then it gave me a 404, which is stupid. We're almost ready to go. Come on. Damn it. Try this again. Oh, nailed. Woohoo. Almost ready. All righty then. God, come on. There we go. Speaking of failed attempts, welcome to This and That for the 17th of September. We're plowing through. We're at Hudson, chapter 7, the failed attempt. A failed attempt to industrialize high finance. So Martin Lipton, the inventor of the poison pill for corporate defense, writes, activism has caused companies to cut R&D, capital investment, and most significantly, employment. It forces companies to lay off employees to meet quarterly earnings. It is a disaster for the country. So every economy is planned in some way. It's quite true, some way or another. Feudal economies were planned by the heirs of the warlord bands that conquered the land, living off their rents and taxing the economy to pay for more military conquests. The Industrial Revolution led merchants and industrialists to fight against the landed interest, and its associated military adventurism that loaded nations down with public debts and the taxes levied to carry their interest charge. You know, this is just standard, right? You build up debts because you're declaring war on everybody. Everyone can hear me now, right? Everyone okay with this? Yes?
Yeah, I can.
All righty. Throughout history, the wealthiest families have seeded economic and political institutions with leaders to defend their interests, typically using banks as their center of power. This chapter is essentially is the story of two banking systems, essentially. We can see some of the results in the current situation. You could say that the Swiss, Anna can tell us more about this, but I would assume that the Swiss banks are more like German banking of the 19th and 19th century, at least 20th century, and the American banks are more Anglo-American. And this chapter talks about the difference between the two styles, if you want to call them styles. You could say that in the case of Anglo-American banking, the Anglo-American banking system, that it tends to favor kind of short-term advantages and not for sort of longer-term issues of, financial stability, let's put it that way. And we can see how that operates in the very simple example of Trump running out of money in the 90s or whatever it was, and he got $300 million from Deutsche Bank. Now, he didn't have the credit for the $300 million, but who underwrote the loan? And nobody has admitted this officially, but it seems pretty obvious. And when you look at sort of the circumstantial data, the Russians in other words, they advanced him more money than he really deserved from a credibility point of view. And I think, that's the son, his banker at the time, I think, was the son of the Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. So just so you know.
And I picked up
at Deutsche Bank, the Deutsche Bank branch in New York. The Medici supplied Popes Leo X, Clement the Seventh, Pius the Fourth, and Leo the Ninth. That's 1513 to 1605. Essentially, the mid-Renaissance to up through the Baroque, if you're thinking art historically. Elsewhere in feudal Europe, landed aristocrats ran economies for their own interest. Yet, despite the Industrial Revolution,
let me think this through.
Few global managers today are drawn from industry. Most economic decision makers have been trained in business schools to view companies primarily as vehicles to produce financial gains.
I was going to use that. Hudson.
National policy in today's world is planned mainly by financial loyalists to serve financial interests. That is, central bank and U.S. Treasury officials are on loan from Wall Street, above all from Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup. National City Bank of the First National City Bank of New York is Citigroup.
I don't know what
Goldman Sachs roster of CEOs and public services hallmarked by Treasury Secretaries Robert Rubin.
I don't even
This
know.
is from the Clinton era at Goldman, 1996 to 1992. And Hank Paulson, 2006 to 2009 Treasury Secretary, and it was at Goldman from 1970.
Excuse me, Anne, you're going to have to tell Kelly to mute.
What?
Trap. Throw the trap.
Well, poison kind of works.
Okay, I'll dump it.
I don't know. Why don't you do this? Stick it in the garage and come and wash your hands.
Well, I tried to mute that.
Oh, no.
Anyway.
Kelly, you're not muted.
Let me just say that the next whole paragraph, so if this continues, I won't reel through all these names, but the point is a whole bunch of people in terms of global finance have worked for Goldman Sachs. I mean, people who are in charge of all kinds of stuff, and not in the U.S. alone, but in foreign countries, heads of the Bank of England and blah, 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 Italy, et cetera, et cetera. You could say Goldman Sachs is the world's bank, not quite, but it is a significant player. And needless to say, it leads to all other kinds of suggestions about the power of private banks. Robert Rubin provides the most important link, leaving the Clinton administration to head Citigroup in 1999, receiving over $120 million in compensation during his tenure over the next decade. He was helped by the Treasury Secretary Jack Lew during 2006, 2008, and Lew worked for the Obama administration, and earlier by Stanley Fischer during blah, 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 President Obama's nominee for vice chairman of the Fed. This team dug the hole that ran Citigroup into the ground, but its political influence led the U.S. government to pump in $45 billion in equity. made $300 billion in asset guarantees, and the Fed chipped in over $2 trillion in below market rate loans to the listing shipwreck. The way in which these managers of U.S. government policy obliterated Citigroup's net worth prompted FDIC Chair Sheila Bair to characterize Citigroup as a former commercial bank hijacked by an investment banking culture. Recall that we talked about the difference between commercial banks and investment banks relative to the Big Short, that made profits through high-stakes betting, calling it the worst-run bank in the United States, having bought into all the gimmicks to generate short-term profits, poorly underwritten loans, high-risk securities, investments in short-term unstable liquidity. Bair wrote that it was wrecked under Robert Rubin and his hand-picked successor, Vikram Pandit, who wouldn't have known how to write a loan if his life depended on it, but he was the guy Rubin wanted. The Goldman Sachs story has been well told by Matt Taibbi, he of the more recent Trumpist sort of tendency, or Russian tendency, let's put it that way, describing the company as a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. It's really a nicely written little metaphor. The behavior of Goldman Sachs, Citigroups, and other giant banks is extractive, that is charged with fine after fine for repeated public civil frauds perpetuated against their counterparties and clients. Much like Russia's 7 bankers who gained control of that nation's natural resources, land, and infrastructure monopolies under Boris Yeltsin's insider privatizations of the mid-90s, Goldman Sachs managers squeeze out fees, interest, financial and commodity speculation at the economy's expense. Now, lest you think that this still exists, Putin runs a majority of this now simply because Yeltsin did all these insider privatizations, but when Putin came in, he decided to further divide up or seize control of various cadres, as it were, of oligarchs in the context of sort of how the economy is run. Their idea of a free market is non-enforcement of regulatory checks on investment bankers who view new technology and privatization of the public domain mainly as opportunities to make underwriting and management fees and enormous stock price gains. Now, lest you think this is unimportant, the fall of Truth Social stock, because it's all, it's badly managed and falling in value. Just today, or yesterday actually, Donald Trump created a new what's called decentralized finance, a kind of entity built on Bitcoin and a certain element of Bitcoin. Anyway, what he's doing, it's a new scam. It's structured actually very similar to the way Truth Social is set up. That is 70% of this new Trump thing is going to be privately held or held by a majority, an elite, let's put it that way, which includes Guido, Don Jr., et cetera, Eric, et al. So that's kind of what has just happened. And they were pimping it, and needless to say, when Trump said he was going to make the U.S. which is sort of oxymoronic, how would you make the U.S. the capital of Bitcoin? It's just, or the capital of crypto. Anyway, toward this end, financial lobbyists and the politicians whose campaigns they underwrite demand veto power over the appointment of regulators, central bankers, and treasury officials. It didn't have to be this way. While rent theory was refined to tax or nationalize the takings of landlords and monopolies in the 19th century, a parallel financial reform movement flowered in France and Germany. Having less capital available than England, these countries could not afford the predatory practices of British merchant banking, inspired largely by the French reformer Henri de Saint-Simon. Advocates of industrialization developed a strategy to restructure financial systems to promote industry. Saint-Simon, along with early socialists and the large German banks that flowered in the Bismarck era designed more productive banking systems to overtake Britain's head start by coordinating industrial investment with state-sponsored investment and planning. And as an aside right now, I'm going to go to the next paragraph in a second, but you could say that, the rise of a German military naval construction in the late 19th century was, if you have the economy set up to do that, to challenge the dominance of the British Navy, for example, that, you can see how competitive that can get in the 19th century and how stupid it can get once you figure out in the early 20th century that you can destroy battleships pretty easily with aircraft carriers and airplanes. But anyway, but the past century has shown that financial systems do not automatically evolve to optimize society's technological potential. Instead of steering savings, credit, and industrial profits into new tangible capital investment, employment, research, and development, today's banks and money managers are diverting savings and lending away from financing productive enterprise while finding their major loan market in rent extraction opportunities at the expense of economic growth. So in other words, people are driven by short-term profit to move into the fire sector, as opposed to thinking, more, if you're thinking like a nationalist or whatever, patriotically, you might think more about economic growth. But anyway, rather than greed. How debt service raises costs and prices. It seems remarkable how much more clearly 18th and early 19th century writers discuss the way in which debt service raises costs and prices compared to today's economists. 8 centuries of warfare with France had driven Britain deeply into debt. Parliament issued new bonds. Well, Britain fought amongst itself for many of those centuries anyway. Parliament issued new bonds to finance each new conflict with a new excise tax levied to pay its interest charge. Most such taxes were levied on consumer essentials, raising the cost of living and hence the price of labor. Costs were further increased by the high prices charged by trading monopolies that governments created and sold to investors to retire their bonds. A monopoly on certain items that came from certain places. Let's just put it that way. Tobacco, sugar, whatever. The tax and monopoly problems with us were basically a byproduct of the public debt problem. In 1744, Matthew Decker, a merchant and director of the East India Company, attributed the deterioration in Britain's industrial competitiveness to the taxes imposed on food and other essentials to pay the interest charges on its public debt. Much like private sector interest charges today, these taxes pushed up the subsistence wage that employers had to pay, and hence the prices they had to charge as compared to those of less debt-ridden economies. So, this is that difference. In the preface to his essay on the causes of the decline of the foreign trade, Decker wrote, and this is the 18th century, wrote, by imposing a prodigious artificial value upon our goods to the hindrance of their sale abroad, these debts and taxes threaten to price British exports out of world markets. Now, funding wars by running into debt instead of on a pay-as-you-go basis was called Dutch financing because, as Adam Smith explained, the Dutch, as well as several other foreign nations, hold a very considerable share of our public funds. In fact, they held more than half of the securities in the major British Crown corporations, including the East India Company and Bank of England. Now, you can see that doing this, holding securities on the former Dutch East India Company and how it becomes the British East India or the East India Company, you can see, kind of where colonialism and imperialism all sort of come together. The interest and dividends Britain dished out to these foreign investors absorbed much of its trade surplus. As foreigners possess a share of our national funds, Adam Smith explained, they render the public in a manner tributary to them and may in time occasion the transport of our people and our industry. As early as 1757, the English commercial sage Malachi Postlethwaite decried the remittance of interest, dividends, and capital to Dutch investors. He estimated that the 7 Years' War from 1757 to 63 cost Britain £82 million. In the year the conflict broke out, his pamphlet on Great Britain's true system explained that the outflow of bullion drained money needed to employ labor, leaving Britain with little domestic market for its own products. Even if all the debt were held at home, he warned, it would not, upon that account, be less pernicious. The taxes levied to service the public debt increased the price of necessities and hence the cost of labor and overall costs by at least 31% of the annual expense of the whole people of England. Pretty significant. What Britain might win militarily, it would lose commercially as a result of royal military ambitions. The more the nation runs into debt, the more money will be locked up in the funds, and the less will there be employed in trade. Economies would gain more power by investing their savings productively at home rather than going into debt to finance their military adventures. Before such debt took place, everybody possessed their whole gains, Postlethwaite pointed out. Taxing the population to pay interest to creditors drained money that otherwise would be used or could be used for private investment. So, quote, if the present public debt, instead of being increased, was paid off, the profits of the manufacturers, tradesmen, and merchants, etc., would all be their own, doubling the rate of profit. By avoiding wars and their debts, Britain could undersell our neighbors. New arts and new manufactures would be introduced, and the old ones brought to greater perfection. To make matters worse, Postlethwaite added, bondholders spent their revenue unproductively, creating monopolies and sponsoring financial bubbles. In a message that could well describe the 2001-2008 bubble, he described, note that the 2001 to 2008 is the dot-com to, the Great Recession. You could just, there's a bubble in there, and we were running a war, needless to say, during that whole period. He described how the financial maneuverings of this day created monopolies and tricked investors out of their savings. Funding and jobbing too often introduces combination and fraud and all sorts of traffic. It hath changed honest commerce into bubbling, our traders into projectors, industry into tricking, and applause is earned when the pillory is deserved. This Postlethwaite might have been speaking of today's economies and warning that while there's a lot more to be got by jobbing than by discharging our debts, all arts will be used to increase the new debts, not to redeem the old. The protestations by Decker and Postlethwaite, and later by Adam Smith himself against the sale of public monopolies, anticipated today's complaints that monopoly charges, interest, and other financial charges push up the prices that labor and industry must pay, as well as emigration of their labor in order to find work. And this is kind of the current situation now, isn't it, right? In Europe, you have people, trying to get across the channel, blah, blah, blah. And then this other, fake thing about the U.S. southern border, et cetera. The great political economist James Stewart, author of An Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy, warned in 1767, if we suppose governments to go on increasing every year the sum of their debts upon perpetual annuities and appropriating in proportion every branch of revenue for the payment of them, the consequence will be, in the first place, to transport in favor of the creditors the whole income of the state. Indeed, for the typical year of 1783, the historian Leland Jenks has calculated that Britain's government paid out some 3/4 of its tax revenue to bondholders. Now, if you want to think about now what's going on in 1783, you have a kind of a little, armed struggle in the colonies going on. There's other reasons why, the Brits gave up and, gave up the country, our little country here. 9 million pounds when the entire annual turnover of British foreign trade did not exceed 35 million. By 1798, in the wake of the American and French revolutions, William Pitt's policy of borrowing instead of saving on a tax-as-you-go basis imposed interest charges so heavy that the nation was mortgaged to a new class of society, the rentiers, the fund holders, for an annual sum of 30 million pounds, 3 times the public revenue before the Revolutionary Wars. The bulk of this sum was being collected in customs, excise, and stamp duties, and constituted an engine by which wealth was transferred from a large consuming public to the much smaller number who now owned consols. These were government bonds with no fixed maturity, paying interest for as long as the bonds were not redeemed. So there's this kind of loose financing going on. Adam Smith spelled out the geopolitical implication. Wars eroded rather than built British power. Higher debts and the taxes to pay the interest charges on Britain's war debts threatened to increase its production costs and hence its export prices, impairing the balance of trade and draining its bullion abroad. If today's trade theory has little to say about how debt or rentier charges affect domestic and international prices, it's largely due to David Ricardo's lobbying on behalf of financial interests, arguing that debt levels and payment of interest to foreigners did not matter, as if such payments would be automatically self-correcting. Yeah, sure. His writings and parliamentary testimony laid the groundwork for 2 centuries of narrow-mindedness down through Milton Friedman and the Chicago School, crowding out the more sophisticated analysis developed by critics of Ricardo's banking class. Now, you can see some of that kind of primitive thinking in the Trump tariff policy. Saint-Simon and French industrial reform. Although Britain was the home of the Industrial Revolution, the 300 miles from Dover, it was French and German writers who took the broadest perspective in theorizing about how banking and credit systems could best be organized to fund industry. The French had a particular reason to focus on banking reform. Their financial system had not evolved much since the pre-revolutionary Ancien Regime. To catch up with Britain and other nations advancing technological potential, Count Claude-Henri de Saint-Simon, he lived from 1760 to 1825, and his followers provided the guiding philosophy to create an industrial credit system. This is important because it is a kind of contrast to the organization of credit in the British context. Like many well-born aristocrats, Saint-Simon came to attack the inherited privileges of his class as a useless rentier burden on society. At the age of 60, in 1819, he published a satire, Parabole Politique, depicting France's governing aristocracy as living off inherited wealth. This is the post-Napoleonic era. Collecting rent and interest without performing a productive function. The French Revolution had overthrown this hereditary feudal nobility politically, but not economically. This is the issue that we see underlying, why people are thinking about, the physiocrats are thinking about this because, well, how are we going to get this to organize since some of these people are still in place? In this respect, Saint-Simon was a market reformer. What made him more radical than today's free marketeers was his treatment of inherited wealth as a market imperfection. This is the kind of core to the Piketty argument, isn't it? His followers depicted the rent, interest, and dividends from land ownership, bonds, and stocks as a vestigial post-feudal overhead. They were tributary claims on society's income and output, a legacy of the dead hand of the past. Saint-Simon's key reform was to replace debt financing with equity ownership shares. If loan proceeds are invested to produce a profit, he argued, now the borrower can pay interest out of the venture's proceeds as dividends from its earnings, right? And sort of, you can see that makes a little more sense in some ways. Dividends on equity capital, literally an ownership share, can be cut when profits decline, but bank loans and bonds bear interest that must be paid regardless of the fortunes of the debtor. Missing a debt payment may lead to default and forfeiture of assets when creditors foreclose. Saint-Simon laid out the logic for banks to take ownership shares in their customers rather than making straight loans. Hoping to train a meritocracy of industrial engineers, Saint-Simon's followers transformed government's role away from supporting idle rentier aristocracies. Assuming that talent was best able to show its abilities in industry, they sought to create a new type of industrial capitalist, the travailleur. In contrast to the projectors, adventurers, and pirates of John Law's day, the banks would invest directly in industry, not merely for speculative or mercantile gains. Within the ranks of capitalist, bankers were glorified as the future organizers and promoters of industry. According to the 1831 Religion Saint-Simonienne, Économie Politique et Politique, the banks perform the role of capitalists in their transactions with those travailleurs to whom they loan money, enabling industrious people to obtain financing for their enterprise. As the spirit of early industrial and banking reform gained momentum, the Saint-Simonian reformers attracted supporters ranging from socialists to investment bankers and won government backing for their policies under France's Third Empire. They went further than British and American land taxation advocates such as Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill by placing heavier emphasis on the need for financial reform. Their ranks included the social theorist Auguste Comte, the economist Michel Chevalier, the socialist Pierre Leroux, the engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, whose plans for canals elaborated ideas initiated by Saint-Simon. De Lesseps, is the Suez, etc. De Lesseps is engaged in that process. And the brothers Emile and Isaac Pereire, who founded the Credit Mobilier in 1852 to give institutional expression to Saint-Simon's banking ideals. It was left to Emile Pereire, 1800 to 1875, to begin putting Saint-Simon's ideas into effect. In the 1830s, Pereire built France's first railway line from Paris to Saint-Germain and later developed other routes. In 1852, he formed the Société Générale de Crédit Mobilier as a joint stock bank with his younger brother Isaac. Their guiding principle was to provide low-cost, long-term credit that would enable industrialists to expand production. It's very production side oriented. Instead of extending loans directly to its customers, the Credit Mobilier invested in stocks and bonds issued by these companies. You can see there's an investment model here at work. Returns were expected to be higher than the rate of interest it paid depositors. The institution was in effect a gigantic holding company engaged in financing and managing industrial enterprises, notes George Edwards. The securities of the controlled companies were used as assets on which the Credit Mobilier issued its own securities to be sold to the public. For a number of years, the bank was highly successful and performed notable service in promoting railroads and public utilities. Now, unless you think that's unimportant, the fact that the French could do crazy crap, or take on ideas about, for example, world's fairs, etc. You could say that some people like, Eiffel and etc. were kind of interesting examples of that. But this freer supply of long-term equity capital and bond financing proved to be the bank's undoing. A downturn comes over the course of every business cycle. When profits declined and stock prices crashed in 1866, they were really common. The Credit Mobilier suffered both as banker and a stockholder, could not turn these investments into immediate cash to pay depositors' liquidity or write down or delay payment on what it owed. Matters were aggravated by the bank's crony capitalism links to Louis Napoleon's government, you think? Insider speculation drove Credit Mobilier bankrupt in 1867 and to liquidation in 1871. Financial scandals were endemic to the 19th century's largest international investments, headed by the Suez and Panama Canal schemes. Both were early Saint-Simonian ideas. And almost wherever governments were involved. The most notorious, of course, and this history is very dense, but very important and not taught well enough. America's railroad land grants to robber barons whose stock and bond waterings, that is, diluting shares by simply printing more stock and giving them to directors, insiders, and the politicians being bribed, see Truth Social, helped give high finance its bad name. As aggregations of finance capital grew larger and more closely linked to government, banking systems became prone to such dealings. Saint-Simon's influence on Marx and other socialists. The idea of mobilizing banking to finance industry soon spread beyond France. Saint-Simon's influence extended to John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, and Christian socialists, as well as to industrialists. The common denominator of this broad political spectrum was recognition that an efficient industrial credit system was needed. This is the production side, right? Remember, production as opposed to distribution. Engels wrote that Marx spoke only with admiration of Saint-Simon's genius and encyclopedic brain. However, Marx wrote sarcastically of his world-redeeming credit fantasies and believed that followers such as Charles Fourier and Auguste Comte were utopian in their hope to reconcile the interests of capital and labor. There's a certain, liberalism at work there. What Marx shared with Saint-Simon was an optimism that the banking and credit system would evolve in such a way that signifies no more and no less than the subordination of interest-bearing capital to the conditions and requirements of the capitalist mode of production, rather than the reverse, right? Marx contended that any conflict of interest between financial and industrial capital would be settled in favor of the latter. This violent fight against usury, this demand for the subordination of the interest-bearing under the industrial capital was a prerequisite for grounding capitalist production in the modern banking system, which on the one hand robs usurers' capital of its monopoly by concentrating all fallow money reserves and throwing them on the money market, and on the other hand limits the monopoly of the precious metals themselves by creating credit money. So in this paragraph, you can see kind of where Marx is thinking about there. He's going, well, this thing kind of works pretty well because it's sort of, it's slightly isolated from this, and it could work actually better at a kind of theoretical or abstract level. That's kind of Marx thinking idealistically. Marx described usury as an ancient practice independent of the mode of production, growing by its own compound interest dynamics in ways that historically had been parasitic. Usurer's capital does not confront the laborer as industrial capital, but merely impoverishes this mode of production, paralyzes the productive forces instead of developing. Well, Marx is not wrong. Usury transfers ownership of assets to usurers, making life harder for the laborer and serving as a brake on industrial capitalism, preventing the social productivity of labor from developing. This is Marx writing, usury centralizes money wealth. It does not alter the mode of production, but it attaches itself as a parasite and makes it miserable. It sucks its blood, kills its nerve, and compels reproduction to proceed under even more disheartening conditions. Reliance on usurers for credit, Marx granted, would persist for needy individuals, such persons or classes as do not borrow in the sense corresponding to the capitalist mode of production. But the great financial achievement of industrial capitalism would be to create a superior outlet for saving than the consumer usury and war lending that characterized pre-industrial banking. Usury capital no longer would be able to block society from achieving its technological potential once an industrial banking system came into being to provide low interest credit to be invested productively. So you can see that Marx, in his thinking there, was thinking at a more technocratic sort of way. That it's all going to work outright because it would sort of squash any kind of waste or greediness. Marx expected increasingly capital-intensive production to require more credit. The question was how to supply it. Given his faith in the driving force of technological evolution, see, I'm talking technocratically, Marx asserted that the destiny of industrial capitalism was to modernize finance, turning usurious lending into productive industrial banking. Financial institutions would become society's means of planning the future as banks reinvested their interest revenue in new loans to expand the means of production and pay interest out of profits. That's very, Saint-Simonian. As matters turned out, Marx proved too optimistic. In fact, nobody of his epoch was so pessimistic as to anticipate banking to behave the way it does today, stripping capital and adding financial overhead to the cost of production. Expecting industrial capitalists to shape financial systems to serve their needs, Marx assumed that the most productive banking systems would survive to serve the industrial host and in due course to socialize finance. So you can see kind of where Marx is thinking here, that it would, sort of fix itself. And indeed, this seemed to be occurring in Germany, where Bismarck's state socialism found its financial expression in the Reichsbank and other large industrial banks that became part of the trinity of banking, heavy industry, and government. Needless to say, that is also part of the problem of the relation between the German state and industry relative to, the debts accrued after the reparations and all that other fiasco stuff after World War I. The emergence of German industrial banking. So there's a little section here that I just took from Wikipedia on the German Historical School of Economics. More importantly, it has people like Weber and Schumpeter as part of that. So that's why in American academia, particularly in economics, you have this certain German thing that goes on in the background. The historical school of economics was an approach to academic economics and public administration that emerged in the 19th century in Germany and held sway there until well into the 20th century. The professors involved compiled massive economic histories of Germany and Europe. Numerous Americans were their students. The school is opposed by theoretical economists. So the point is that it's a more historical approach rather than doing the math. Not that they didn't know the math, it's just, it's different. Prominent leaders included von Schmoller, Weber, and Schumpeter. The historical school held that history was the key source of knowledge about human actions and economic matters, since economics was culture specific and hence not generalizable over time and space. Well, yes, it is, but whatever. The school rejected the universal validity of economic theorems. They saw economics as resulting from careful empirical and historical analysis instead of from logic and mathematics. And that was a very important division. And needless to say, neoclassicism made that all go to hell because, it's just a lot easier. The math works out better on the neoclassical side. The school also rejected mathematical modeling. The German Historical School of Economists was the most optimistic and expecting finance to promote industrial prosperity. Wilhelm Roscher pointed to the fact that interest rates tended to fall steadily with the progress of civilization. At least rates had been falling since medieval times. A more socially productive credit system was replacing the age-old usury problem. You could see how optimistic you could get, except, maybe it's just a long wave. That's the French approach to it. Credit laws were becoming more humanitarian as debtors' prisons were being phased out throughout Europe. And yes, they were. While more lenient bankruptcy laws were freeing individuals to start afresh with clean slates. Bankruptcy law is like, we were talking about jubilees and stuff like that. It's kind of what bankruptcy law does. Lacking the funds necessary to expand on a large scale, German industry relied on banks for a broad range of long-term investment and short-term financing, recognizing that reinvesting profits and expanding production limited the ability to pay interest. Banks willingly accepted part of their return in higher yielding equity shares, that is in stock rather than on interest on outright loans. So you can see there's a thing going on in terms of what equity is in this particular context. This Sansomonian idea was followed. Simply, it's the most pragmatic and remunerative practice. In Germany, bank owners were the most important source of capital, not depositors, as was the case in Britain. A middle class of German savers emerged only gradually. So you can see the difference in the middling classes in that particular kind. It's not that like there wasn't a German middle class, but you can see this kind of division. This focus on owner's equity prompted German banks to resist the speculative excesses found in American finance of the period. Loans and bond issues were kept to the actual cash value of the property of the corporation being financed. At the other end of the debt equity spectrum, U.S. financiers engaged in stock waterings that overfunded companies by bond issues far beyond their needs or capacity to carry. The difference was pocketed by the directors of these corporations, a practice that led much honest industry to stay clear of Wall Street. And you see how the divisions are created. And yes, there are plenty of American scandals that are the subject of this kind of stupidity. Fraud was almost built into the system. A distinguishing feature of America's Gilded Age proved to be the ability of insiders to prevent financial checks from being legislated. Kleptocracy, and to render attempts along these lines ineffective in practice. It's not industry, but railroads, which European countries kept in the public domain, that provided the basis for America's stock market, which was used largely to create trusts and monopolies. This is the whole thing, the story for, Citizen Kane, actually, to talk about trusts and monopolies, the problem of trusts and monopolies at the end of the 19th century. Its heroes were insiders gaining fortunes by stock market raids, politicking for land giveaways, manipulating stock prices, and issuing bonds to themselves and friendly politicians and lawmakers. As matters have turned out, this is the financial system that has won the struggle for survival. So there's a World One debate over German versus Anglo-Dutch banking. So when war broke out in 1914, Germany's rapid victories over France and Belgium seemed to reflect the superior efficiency of its financial system. To the German priest politician Friedrich Naumann and the English economist H.S. Foxwell, the Great War appeared as a struggle between rival forms of financial organization to decide who would rule Europe, and beyond that, whether the continent would have a laissez-faire or a more state socialist economy. In 1915, shortly after fighting broke out, Naumann summarized the continental banking philosophy in Mitteleuropa, from which Foxwell drew for his argument, in two highly influential essays, The Nature of the Industrial Struggle and The Financing of Industry and Trade. In particular, Foxwell cited Naumann's contention that the old individualistic capitalism of what he calls the English type is giving way to the new, more impersonal group form, to the disciplined, scientific capitalism he claims is German. Germany recognized that the industrial technology required to catch up with Britain needed long-term financing in addition to government support. Those battleships won't build themselves. In the emerging integration of industry, banking, and government, Foxwell observed that finance was undoubtedly the main cause of the success of modern German enterprise. Holding equity capital as an ownership share of profits instead of straight debt, banks took the lead in much of the planning that guided Germany's development. Bank staffs were forging industrial policy into a science, becoming engineers under the new industrial philosophy of how public policy should shape credit markets. There's kind of an overlap between the financial components of the large German corporation and the banks in that particular context. In America, Thorstein Veblen soon voiced much of the same theory in The Engineers in the Price System. The political connections of German bankers gave them a decisive voice in formulating international diplomacy, making mixed banking the principal interest in the extension of her foreign trade and political power. German bank officials sat on their boards and extended loans to foreign governments on condition that German clients would be named as the, you can see how this turns mercantile, right? German clients would be named as the chief suppliers in major public investments. It seemed that the dynamics of economic history were leading towards this type of symbiosis between national planning and large-scale financing of heavy industry. The short time frame of loans and liquidity characteristic of England's merchant bankers ill-suited them for this kind of task. By focusing on trade financing rather than long-term industrial development, English bankers preferred to lend against collateral in place and available for liquidation in the event of default. Inventories, money due on bills for goods in transit and sold to customers, but not yet paid for, and real estate. This prompted Foxwell to warn that British manufacture of steel, automobiles, capital equipment, and other heavy industry were in danger of becoming obsolete, largely because the nation's bankers failed to perceive the need to extend long-term credit and increase equity investment. British bankers paid out most of their earnings as dividends instead of investing in the shares of the companies that their loans supposedly were building up, you know, like the Germans. They also pressed their industrial clients to pay out the maximum proportion of earnings as conditions for the loan. This short time horizon forced borrowers to remain liquid rather than giving them the leeway to pursue long-term strategies. By contrast, German banks paid out dividends and expected such dividends from their client at only half the rate of British banks, preferring to retain earnings as capital reserves to build up equity. So two kinds of banking vied against each other: extractive Anglo-Dutch American collateral-based lending against existing real estate and orders on hand versus a productive long-term credit to fund tangible capital formation and infrastructure. As I said, it's kind of like battleships. Although Britain was the home of the Industrial Revolution, little manufacturing was financed in its early stages by bank credit. Most innovators were obliged to raise money privately. And you can argue that in a Hayekian way, that, well, you know, you have a wider base of independent entrepreneurship, blah, 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 blah. And, well, you could sort of say that, but it's a lot. I don't think you could argue it very well. Let's put it that way, unless you're looking at different regions of Britain. Britain's stockholders were no more up to the task of financing industry than were its banks, having an equally short-term frame of reference. stock markets were dominated by railroads, canals, and large public infrastructure utilities. After earning their commissions on one issue, they just moved on to the next one without much concern for what happened to investors who had bought the earlier securities. As soon as he has contrived to get his issue quoted at a premium and his underwriters have been unloaded at a profit, complained Foxwell, his enterprise ceases. To him, as the Times says, a successful flotation is of more importance than a sound venture. As I have said years ago, it's about the float. In sum, the aim of British and American banks was to maximize their own short-run advantage, not to create a better and more productive economy by planning for the future. Most banks favored large real estate borrowers, along with railroads and public utilities whose income streams easily could be forecast. Manufacturing only obtained significant bank and stock market credit once companies had grown fairly large. And you want to use an example? The General Electric, General Electric, Westinghouse, Edison, all that stuff. It has that kind of element behind it relative to the money. Veblen's analysis of financial distortions of industrial capitalism, describing the financial class as ascendant. Thorsten Veblen assayed the machinations of high finance, stock watering, and debt pyramiding by Wall Street stock manipulators who dominated the Gilded Age of his day. His theory of business enterprise, 1904, emphasized the divergence between productive capacity and pecuniary gains from inflating stock market prices over and above cost value, that is book value. Today's jargon calls this premium the Q ratio. To Veblen, this pecuniary gain was the aim of Wall Street operators. The upshot of this economic game, as Veblen put it, was not capital investment in plant and equipment to produce profits by employing labor, but speculative capital gains in asset prices, an exercise in promotion and collusion, not unlike land speculators puffing up the market. And yes, that has a deep history in the United States. Emphasizing how financial predation was hijacking the economy's technological potential, Veblen described the manner in which industry was becoming financialized in ways that put financial gains ahead of production. Now, meanwhile, the FIRE sector, that is finance, insurance, and real estate sectors, were joining forces to fuel property speculation. Bank credit inflated asset prices by lending primarily to buy shares in real estate, not to produce more. This finance-driven practice was imposing a debt overhead that threatened to end in corporate bankruptcy and liquidation. Yet Veblen was as optimistic as Marx when it came to industrial capitalism's potential to uplift society. It's a very modernist view, right? That it's Tomorrowland. It's going to get better. If it enacted social reforms to check the predatory behavior of banks, absentee property owners, and monopolists. But Veblen saw that while technological innovation was trimming costs, it was also breeding monopolies. The fruits of rising productivity were being appropriated by robber barons who had no better use of their wealth than to create trusts to dictate high prices and extract economic rent. Excuse me. Veblen's description of the dynamic that has led financial managers to use profits not to invest, but to pay out dividends or to buy up their company's stock, raising the value of their stock options, has been largely vindicated. You can say that still happens. Hedge funds have become notorious for stripping assets and loading companies down with debt, leaving bankrupt shells in their wake, in which George Akerlof and Paul Romer, Nobel Prizes, have characterized as looting. Lending and debt are becoming more usurious and less productive. More usurious. If you could argue about, usury in the present day, you could. The end result is to impose austerity regimes rather than promote growth, tangible capital formation, and rising living standards. Now, the question is, will financial pessimism trump industrial optimism? It's not as easy as that, particularly relative to the fact that you get a Great Depression, a World War, a post-war prosperity. All of those things happen, so you can't just sort of put one thing against the other. This exists all through the period, and then you have other kinds of political issues. After World War I, banking through most of the world adhered to the Anglo-Dutch model. Germany not only lost the war, but also saw the post-war leaders of Europe reject its philosophy of industrial banking and the warnings against predatory finance. Instead of governments coordinating industrial planning, finance has taken over the corporate and also government policymaking. Bankers and financial managers are indebting economies without putting in place new means of production to pay off their mushrooming debt overhead. Industry has been financialized and planning has been centralized in Wall Street, London, the Paris Bourse, and Frankfurt, instead of in public hands as socialists expected, or those of industrial engineers as Veblen forecast. Stock and bond markets have been transformed into arenas for debt leveraging as the post-industrial means of appropriating property. The major financial innovations have been corporate junk bonds into the 1980s, junk mortgages, and complex financial derivatives in the 2000s. Even though rising productivity lowered the direct costs of production, prices have continued to rise, mainly as a result of the steady buildup of financial charges, that is, interest, fees, and insurance, as well as real estate rents and monopoly pricing. These charges have risen not by increasing the money supply, but by a way in which the financial system adds to the debt overhead. Interest and debt repayment has been engineered into the cost of doing business, and increasingly as a cost of living at the expense of spending on goods and services, investment and employment. The price rise is aggravated by rent extracting, privatization of public infrastructure to create private rentier fortunes by predatory pricing for essential services. This is the core of the American medical industry, or health industry, or however you want to call it. The aim of a financialized economy is to make money for a narrow financial layer by establishing a credit stranglehold on industry and labor and on the government itself. This reverses the direction in which classical political economies seem to be moving, to propel governments out of the feudal era by reforming the way society employs and accumulates wealth. In a modern version of the feudal epoc's primitive accumulation, remember we're looking at primitive accumulation and then capitalist accumulation by military seizure, primitive accumulation by military seizure in the feudal period, right? 1066, Magna Carta, all that crap, military seizures of stuff. Financial dynamics serve to concentrate wealth by means of debt leveraging and privatization, loading down industry, real estate, and infrastructure with debt. Okay, that's chapter 7, and perhaps there's comments or questions. Let's go into fraud was almost built into the system. There we go. Yes, it's nice when you pay your dividends when you have profits, but if you're a low-income worker without a steady income, pay your damn rent and health insurance and everything, no matter what. Poor high finance. Yes, it is just bad social design in that sense. I mean, truly, if you really calculate what happens with the universal, universal basic incomes, it's just unreal to why create these privations unless you're just racist or sexist or whatever. And it is this tap opening. Yes. Let's see, cock-a-hoop. Externalities. Yes, war is damn expensive. Yes, the externalities, damage to the environment. Yes. Just war is stupid. It does. It just focuses production, military Keynesianism and all that. I mean, it can do good things, but it requires a lot more intelligence and not so much looting. And there's so much looting that went on during the war on all sides. Everybody made a little money. It's just unfortunate, but that's what happened. Let's see, anything else? We pretty much covered all that. Thank you for those who have made comments in the chat. I hope that I addressed most of them. Are there any other questions, comments, brickbats at all?
Yeah, Medici, that's a bank?
Sorry, I tried again.
Medici, is that a bank?
No, the Medici. It's
Medici?
It is a family. It's a family business. And all of the different Medici spawn, they controlled various city-states, controlled the Vatican. There were several
Okay.
the Medici popes. The issue of Medici banks is also the Pope's bank. I mean, you've got all that stuff going on at the same time. In the early era of, sort of city states and, different regional divisions and feudal fighting among various families, right? The Borgias and, the Borgias are not the Medici. So you have all this other kind of stuff going on. You have a Borgia Pope at some moment. So you can see how things get a little complicated. That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
But the Medici gave us art. I mean, there's just several decades where the greatest art that has ever been created is Medici art.
I haven't seen that. I think there's some kind of TV show about it, but I haven't seen it.
Oh, there's a wonderful TV show about it. Although I prefer the
Irons.
Borgias. The show The Borgias is much more fun. But yes, the Medicis.
Okay. Well, so this, I guess it kind of started with the Simeon guy,
It's not Simone. Yes.
Saint Simon. Also, I'm sort of curious how things could have gone differently back then, of course, but I think it's
Well,
really interesting.
Well, imagine that during Saint-Simon's period, you could have them sort of thinking about this stuff, but then you have other things going on. You have the kind of moving up and down between royalty and not royalty in charge of the French government, right?
Royalty and not royalty. Okay.
Well, yeah, it went through these little periods of democracy, and then it got fucked up because some guy, the monarchist, took over again, and so that screws up all the set of relations, right?
Right. Yeah. Mixes them
I
up
mean,
again.
it's what's going to happen to the United States if Trump wins. You'll have these dynastic, things that happen.
Right. Yeah. That's the way they want to go. Well, so I also think it's like really instructive to sort of see where Marx got things kind of like not right. He sort of guessed wrong or whatever.
Well, he's at basis of still a philosopher, right? A certain amount of idealism that you're motivated by certain ideals.
I think that's
You know?
how he kind of went wrong there on the.
Well, I don't think he went wrong. I just think you have the theory sort of is still okay. It's just that he didn't have any power. I mean, if he had power, it was within the context of the working class, et cetera, which is on the bottom end, right? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it was only whatever 1850, whatever, when Chartism and all that stuff. The working men didn't get the vote until whatever.
Well, wow, yes, this was all sort of going on at the time too, right?
Oh yeah, you can't see. It's hard to. I mean, I think I could do a lot better than most people. I don't have any power. I mean, I'm going, well, no, you can fix that, you can fix that, and that'd be fine. But I'm, I think in my youth, I thought, well, I could, maybe I could do something and become politically, powerful or whatever. But if you see, just in the American democracy, how many Asian Americans are actually in power? It's not easy to see. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Thanks. That helps.
I mean, I think there are a lot of people who have the answer. It's just that none of us have any power. We all just put our ideas out there, and we're hoping, other people go, oh yeah, I agree with that. Let's kind of do something together and blah, blah, blah. And that'd be all kind of neat, but it just doesn't happen. Or it happens not as fast as we want.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it seems to me there might be like a concerted effort to kind of point out this, some of the things like compound interest and like, how it can go crazy wrong, kind of stuff like that. And then also that, there is this financialization thing, that it's kind of based on this, deceit in how things are accounted for.
Well, yeah, you're measuring against demand, right, or consumption or whatever, right? Because a lot of your stuff just breaks down, and you've got to replace it or do whatever, and you screw yourself up constantly with other things.
Yeah.
I mean, some things are just easy for people, right? If you're in Amazon, they ask whether you want to get insurance on your or service support for your piece of technology. And you think, oh, yeah, well, this thing could break down. And then I'd have to, and no one thinks about all the fucking hassle you have to go in to fix the damn thing. I mean,
Yeah.
to cash in on the little insurance policy. I mean, there's so many little products in the Amazon catalog that they'll ask you, "Oh, do you want to get the a support subscription for it?" And people will go, "Oh, it's only what, $1 or $2 or blah 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 blah," but it adds up. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, and then it's
It
like,
functions like a tax.
you're right, exactly, yeah. And you don't get anything like a better device out of it, right? It's like
No,
the people
you
that
don't get
don't have the
shit.
insurance get screwed.
Well, I mean, when I bought things, rather than get a very expensive computer, I'd get the cheapest fucking computer that they would have and not get insurance on it because, by that time I could buy 3 of the goddamn things.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, I have all these extra computers sitting there. Anyway.
The old Harbor Freight model.
Yes, indeed. It's Harbor
Right.
Freight. Absolutely. Harbor Freight. Other comments, brickbats, interventions, denunciations. Oh,
One of the
thanks.
things,
Thanks,
one
Lane,
of
for
one,
that link on Medici Art. The Medici are really a fun group of folks. Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
yeah, the when you brought up the Medici's and about the what was it? That's the reason the trust got formed, because the Medici's were going to try to take over the church financially.
Oh yeah. Well, they took over everything. I mean,
Right.
you just have all this it's just amazing.
Yeah. Beyond amazing.
I mean, it's very cool. And theoretically speaking, in terms of scholasticism, et cetera, the Italians are really important. I mean, we wouldn't have academia as we have it now without the Italians. I mean, we just wouldn't. I mean, it is the Catholics that have, given us in combination with the traditions from the Mediterranean. You build all of those things together. That is, you have, sort of Arabian math and quasi-classical, ideals. And you sort of put all that shit together and you get, sort of interesting knowledge. I'm sorry, I wax philosophic. You were going to say something? Hello? Have I lost connection? Hello? Hello?
I hear you.
I'm here. I'm here.
Okay. Well, if we're at sort of the end of, I guess we're at the end of my time to yammer. Yeah, it's about the end of yammering time. Let me shut off the live stream so we can utter profanities.